All right, I work outside, so technology doesn't always work for me. So for my information, Melanie has filled us in on your series and where you're at and what you've been discussing, but I just wanted to know a little bit of where you guys are from and what your interests are. Does anyone want to volunteer that information? I know we've got some Forest Service folks here, maybe some outfitter guide folks here. Okay, and we have some BLM Park Service, University. I just want to kind of get a feel. I have a lot of slides. So if you're getting bored, tell me and I'll go faster, but a lot of them are pictures, so it won't be too boring, I promise. So my name is Liz Roberts and I am a biologist for the White River National Forest. At the time that we did this study, my role was very unique. I was a winter sports wildlife biologist, and no one really has those anywhere except for the White River. And the reason for that is the amount of developed and dispersed recreation that occurred on that forest, still occurring on that forest, and the demand with the listed species that we had, one of them being the Canada lynx. So how much of lynx history do you want? A little bit or a lot? I could talk all night. I'll give you a little bit. Lynx was listed in 2000. We were under a new forest plan in 2002, and we had some direction to manage and conserve areas for lynx. So a lot of those areas overlapped winter recreation areas. And when we were doing project analysis and trying to implement our travel management and our new direction, we didn't have the science to make the conclusions that we needed to make, both on the rec side and on the lynx biology side. So that's why we did this study. It started in 2010, and it went until 2014, and we are still working on our publications. Research takes a long time. I just want you to remember that through this presentation, but it's worth it. Okay. Collaboration. I know Melanie was just talking about that. It was huge for the success of this research. We worked with many partners, and without them, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did. And so this is a list of our partners, and there are many individuals that helped out too that I didn't put on this slide, but we recognize them. So the goal. Again, we just did not have the science to support increased recreation, change in developed recreation, change in dispersed recreation. So we wanted to understand in space and time how lynx and winter recreation overlapped. And the reason we chose, well, we had to choose winter recreation is it's when lynx are in their prime home range. And so it's where their basic life characteristics and necessities have to be met in order for them to be successful. And so that's why we're studying them during the winter months. Our first objective, and these are funny to me, I mean, this is almost 10 years later, and these are very loaded, but we were able to tease through some of these. And first was develop ski areas. We wanted to know if they were using them, how they were using them, and how often. And so we wanted to know if they were going into the ski area during operations or whether or not they were staying in there or leaving because of operations. Our second was our dispersed recreation area. Along the White River National Forest, if you travel on I-70, you have Copper Mountain, Val Winter Rec Area, Val Ski Mountain. And then if you go south from there, you've got all sorts of other developed and very highly visited areas. So we wanted to understand lynx relationship with dispersed recreation. And we tiered it into different groups, and you're going to hear a lot about that. So go to 30. So this objective came a little bit later, year 2 in the study. As we were collecting lynx points, we realized we were collecting data on our highway system in Colorado. So we were able to develop maps showing probability of crossing areas across western Colorado, and so that's where this objective came in. So our study area, over the 4 winter seasons, we started up north in the Val Pass Winter Rec area. At the time, it was 2010, at the time we knew we had about 3, 4, 5 resident lynx there, and that's a very small sample size. So we knew we had to have comparisons and go outside that area, so we moved down to the southwest our next year, and then kind of curved back around to Leadville area on our last year. So this is the range of our study area, and they were very different areas, but we learned a lot about recreation in both of those areas. So we were glad to have been both places. Quantifying winter recreation. So I'm a biologist, and they said, okay, if you do this, you have to also study the people out there too. And that was really hard for me because the biologists don't really like to talk to people. And then we had to go out and ask them to do something for us, and we could not give them anything in return. So we quantified winter recreation by trail counters, which were very helpful for portal points. Our first year, we tried doing high-resolution aerial photography. And so we had a plane go and take pictures of the Val Pass Winter Rec area, and then we tried to stratify based on the tracks we were seeing. It was a lot of work, and it really wasn't giving us the answers we wanted, so we only did that our first year. And then number 3 was the asking skiers and snowmobilers to carry a GPS unit. This is 2010, and this is before iPhones had all those apps on them that would, track themselves. And we were pretty cool because people said, oh my gosh, you're going to give us this, and then our incentive then was to mail them a track of where they went for the day. And so the track would have their elevation range, the speed they went, the terrain they went over, and we'd put it on a Google map, and they just thought it was awesome. We stratified our recreation user groups into snowmobile, hybrid snowmobile skiing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, backcountry ski and snowboard, snowshoe, cross-country ski, and then heli skiing when we were down in the southwest. We would approach a group of recreationists, and we'd ask one individual in that group to carry the unit. The unit is this small little sports GPS unit. They don't even make them anymore. But the unit would pick up a point every 5 seconds that the person was recreating. And again, we emailed them their track. It was pretty fun. So at the same time, I had to collar links, and we used GPS technology to collar links. With the GPS collar and the links, it picked up a point every 20 minutes, 24 hours a day. So we actually went through our battery pretty fast, but we felt like it was really important to be tracking them 24 hours a day because we wanted to understand daytime use and nighttime use. So the way we caught lynx is we built them a house in the woods where we thought they might be, and this is what we call a box trap. We would provide food in there for them, and they would have water from snow melt. We would kind of build a shelter. We checked them every 24 hours, so they weren't in there very long. But they would walk in, step on a board, and then the door would shut behind them. And we had our technicians out in the field every day checking all our trap lines. We would put up anywhere from, depending on how many locations we were working on, we had anywhere from 2 lines to 10 lines running. And so we were pretty busy. It was really fun. Our sample size for lynx, it's really hard to trap a lynx. And so we knew we wouldn't have a large sample size, but we had a diverse sample size. We had 20 collared animals to 18 individuals. We had some repeats 2 years in a row up in the Vale area. And we documented over 64,000 lynx points over the 4 years. And our sample window, again, is winter months, January to March. And the first year was really tough because it was a low snow year, and we weren't able to trap till later in the season. So we didn't use a lot of that data in 10. So this is really just for winters of data. Okay, since I'm not going to talk a ton about lynx, I want to just kind of give you a summary. Our focus, like I said in the beginning, we have highway crossing data, recreation user analysis. We're going to go into that. Recreation concentration areas, our data was able to show us some concentration areas between user groups. We studied a little bit about lynx behavior around different recreation types. And so over space and time, we were able to correlate the points and determine whether or not they were having some sort of response based on the level of recreation surrounding them at the time. And then we're working on a co-occurrence paper right now of winter recreation in Canada lynx. So I'm only going to talk about the behavior response because I think it's the most interesting. And there was a lot of assumptions going into this study. There was a lot of, similar to what Melanie was talking about, just a lot of opinions and a lot of user groups saying one is worse than the other and they're having more impact than the other one, therefore we should have more. We didn't know anything. We didn't know what was happening. And so we wanted to be able to answer those questions a lot better. And we felt like this behavioral response would help us with that. Oh, this is an image of lynx points. Those are all different points. Different colors represent a different animal. And then recreation tracks. And I have tons of these, so I'll go over what they mean in a minute. A direct looked at lynx response to seasonal recreation intensity rather than habitat similarities. We were building resource functions that would show us recreation selections and lynx selections, but we wanted to still look at that response. Trying not to get into too much statistics here. Compared lynx movement speed to recreation intensity, compared lynx use versus available points to recreation intensity and time aspects, temporal aspects, and then lynx behavior around developed ski areas. We were really trying to answer that question. So this next image represents our two different study areas. And so our green tracks, and this is a theme throughout the whole presentation, is going to represent what we call our hybrid group. Our blue tracks represent our backcountry skiers group. Our yellow, oranges, I don't know what it shows up there, pretty orange, snowmobiling. And then purple is cross-country skiing, snowshoeing. So the polygons on here are different lynx home ranges. So you can see that their home ranges are pretty large in comparison to where we did our snapshot in time of our recreation points. So this is where this recreation is occurring over a 3-month period, and these are these lynx home ranges that we colored. So you can see that they're coexisting and overlapping and have room outside the recreation footprint. So what we determined through this analysis is lynx slowed their movement rate in the presence of greater snowmobile and backcountry ski activity. So they just slowed down where they were moving. They didn't leave the area, they didn't turn around and go the other direction. They just slowed down and hunkered down while that activity was occurring. In these hybrid areas, and what way we define hybrid, most of you probably already know this. I had no idea what it was until we started studying it. But it's when a snowmobile pulls a skier or snowboarder further out to the backcountry, drops them off, and then they ski in different terrain. And, but we found that there was a lot of overlap with lynx and hybrid skier use. And so they would move faster to either get out of the way. And this really, for me as a biologist, highlighted the importance of security areas for these animals and connectivity. And so while we have a recreated landscape, as long as we have areas that are secure that they can go to while this activity is going on, they can coexist. So it is important to plan for those connectivity areas. And this one I kept in, I was going to take out. But one point I want to make on this slide is that in the Vail area, Vail Pass Winter Rec area sees 35,000 users on average a winter. A lot of use in an area that's concentrated. And in this data analysis, it showed that they were kind of avoiding those snowmobile areas. But down in the San Juans, it's not as crowded, but we still have a lot of snowmobile use down there, and they weren't. And the one difference I wanted to point out, and this is all relative on the data you collect, how you collect it, and the locations you're collecting it. The lynx down in the San Juans were Colorado-born lynx, and they were born into that environment. The lynx that we colored up in the Vail area were actually relocated lynx who were not born in that environment, and so it was new to them. And so that helps kind of understand that difference, because I feel like I was saying two different things, but they are still moving in the same area that the snow machines are. And so here's an image of Ironton, Colorado, where it's a cross-country ski area. And we had a couple of lynx that lived around this cross-country ski area. But I just wanted to show you the overlap. Those red dots are the lynx points. And then you have the cross-country. It's a groomed trail in one area, but they ski around that. And we see a lot of this throughout the whole study, a lot of overlap. This next slide is backcountry skiers in the Ophir, Colorado area, and then the red lines in the back are the heli skiing. But we have some overlap there. Ophir, we were pretty successful in collaring every year down there. There's quite a few lynx that live down in that area. So I'm going to move on to rec now, but just, you know, there is a spatial tolerance. And there is somewhat of a behavioral modification of lynx, but it's not necessarily a negative behavioral modification. But they do adapt to those areas. And rather than leaving high intense areas during the day, they simply become less active. And then after the area settles down, they start moving around in there. With the developed ski area, it was really challenging to do a good data synthesis with there because we just didn't have lynx using the ski area. So we had them collared surrounding the ski area, but they weren't going in and using the ski area. So we can't come to real concrete conclusions about that because we couldn't get them to go in there and show us what they were doing. So I don't really have anything else to say about that. But so now I'm going to go through a few of our recreation data summaries. And when we first started this, we were doing kind of more simple summaries with the recreation data. We were using the trail counters, looking at the portal use, using the GPS units and kind of quantifying use patterns, use intensities, and the number of people out there. So I'm going to go through some of those summaries we came up initially and then what we decided to do with the rec data. So again, here's our recreation footprint up in the Vail area. That green is pretty intense. There's a lot of that hybrid use in the center of the Vail Pass Winter Rec area. But you have every mode of recreation occurring up there. And this is really out of date. There's actually new modes of recreation happening now that we didn't quantify at the time. San Juan recreation footprint, much more spread out. Vail is very concentrated in its designated areas, whereas down in the southwest, it's spread out along the highway system there. Our trail counter data, I thought that there was some interesting information for you here, especially in comparing the two studies. Portals were really important. And portals are really worth quantifying because you can look at entry and exit points anywhere along the line of highway safety, user overlap, and we found that there were areas that were far more used than others, and it was hard to quantify this down in the southwest because you can kind of pull over wherever on the highway and go and recreate in the backcountry there. As you look at the Vail Pass area, there's really only 4 major points you can enter there. I didn't point out in the last one, the top user count, I think, was 4,000 in the San Juans, and in Vail Pass, we had anywhere from 10 to 12,000 users at a portal in one location. So just kind of gives you the difference in scale of user groups of those two study areas. We also worked really closely with the 10th Mountain Hut Division, and we collected some data on hut use, and that was super interesting and really fun. We got to go stay in the huts. So our recreation summary data, like I said, we stratified it into user type. And so we had our hybrid ski, snowboard, snowmobile, snowshoe, and then we added in the heli ski in the Telluride area. So each of those GPS units would collect a long track, but they were picking up a point every 5 seconds. And so at the end of the study, we had over 3 million recreation points, which is a lot of data in comparison to what we were getting for our animal data. And so us biologists decided that maybe we should do something with this data because this is an incredible data set. And there wasn't any other recreation study at the time that had a data set that large. And so we worked with our rec managers to kind of figure out what we could do with this. But Some of our preliminary data, we could look at recreation by month, and 1, 2, 3 is January, February, March, our core months, and we could stratify by use. And that ski, snowboard, I think we changed the colors on this on you, sorry, is pretty popular everywhere. Definitely more popular with the hybrid combination. We had a lot of that. So we looked by month, and then we looked at the days of the week. And one of our requests on the White River was to increase guiding on weekends, and that was really hard with public use. And so we modified some of our outfitter guide permits to maybe increase during the week. Would be a better user guide experience given the numbers we were having on the weekend in some of our areas. We broke it down by hour, and none of this was surprising to us. We knew midday was the most popular time to recreate in the wintertime, especially in Colorado. We looked at distance traveled, and obviously we have our motorized that's going to travel a lot further. But again, this hybrid group was we learned a lot because we didn't even factor this into one of our user groups, and then all of a sudden they were showing us so much about how they used these recreation areas. I was talking about the 10th Mountain Hut. We developed quite a track system for them, which was pretty fun, and there are still people that do hut-to-hut trips. So most people just go into one and out the other, but we actually had some that were hopping around huts. Recreation tracks down again, we're in Mullis Pass area, and you can look at that user group overlap. And those were some of the rec managers down there who were really trying to understand where those concentration areas were, where the overlap was, and this really illustrates a lot of that. This is my favorite track. So this is outside Silverton, and we would meet these backcountry skiers who are amazing. And they would go up in the morning, and then they would go up again. But they would go up and then ski down, and sometimes they do 2 tracks in a day. It was truly amazing. But you could kind of see how they were selecting terrain and where they were headed. And when you designate a whole recreation area, what we were seeing is we're really not using all of that area that's designated. There are limitations and there are preferences. And so we were able to really highlight some of that. Turquoise Lake near Leadville. Last year we moved up to the Leadville area. We had some links that resided in the Collegiate Peak area, and it was pretty popular with every mode of transportation. We were able to collar a couple of links up there, and the recreationists were great and cooperated. We had really great compliance. When we first started the study, people said, nobody's ever going to comply. No one's going to carry a unit for you. People were really excited. We were so appreciative because we couldn't have done it without their cooperation. We looked at recreation around the Loveland Pass area. We were not able to trap any animals in that area, so we didn't really do much with this, with the comparison with links, but we still kept the rec data as part of our data set. And this is skiing again. And this is a little misleading. We cleaned the data and took out the road system. Kind of hybrid, but by car, because the car takes them, and then, you guys know how that works. And then the rec tracks in Ophir, and those guys in Ophir, same thing, go up 2 or 3 times a day and ski. Motorized near Lizard Head Pass, we spent a lot of time up there. We collared a couple of animals near that area as well. There's a big snowmobile run. Probably some of you have done it, but Ophir over to Silverton. And so we had some tracks in there. And then here's an image of heli skiing. So get dropped off on top, ski down. And then this last one is the Val Pass Winter Rec area, a little bit closer up. And it just kind of shows you've got every user group up there, and they really end up, some of this is designation up there, but there's a lot of separation of use up there. Okay, so we had 3 million data points, and we said we have to do something with this. And so as a wildlife biologist, we like to look at habitat suitability, and so we like to build resource selection functions models to look at suitability. So predict, based on what an animal is selecting to live in, we're going to predict how much of that habitat might be available for them to live in the area. So objectives, we have a new objective now. We want to do this recreation analysis. We work with our recreation folks, and we feel like this data can help us a lot. So we want to characterize how each recreation activity type uses winter recreation landscape. Characterize to the extent to which recreation types overlap with one another. That's a big one. We want to know what the overlap is, and then to improve winter dispersed recreation planning, and then any travel management planning. We want to, how we can plan in the future. And again, when I started this study, I was more in the reactive mode. You guys have the opportunity to be very proactive here, which is really amazing, and it's a great opportunity. But I was reacting to things I couldn't answer, and so I was trying to move as fast as I could, and research isn't fast. So we decided to build this resource selection function for people instead of animals, and it turned out to be very informative. So I won't go into too much detail, but a resource selection function is any model that yields values proportional to the probability of use of a resource unit. Oh, that's way too much. So basically, that means that we can take any kind of data point of use, and in this case, we had all these human use data points, and we can figure out different variables that correlate with one another to help us build a footprint of where, if they're going and recreating in this kind of environment, here's another environment very similar to that, which means they could probably recreate there as well. And so we're going to build all these predictive maps to show the potential of different types of recreation across Western Colorado. And so that's what this resource selection modeling did for us under recreation. And so we selected preferences for snowmobilers, hybrid skiers, backcountry skiers. We then had to split some of that into little fine-tune, and I'll talk about that. But we're going to provide Kay and her team these maps of this predictive surface of here's where they can, based on what they're doing, here's where else they can go. So if we're going to do future rec planning, here's potential areas. Now this did not incorporate any current management actions, any other listed species. We just kind of did this blanket prediction model. We didn't factor in any limitations when we did this. We chose 12 environmental covariates across Western Colorado. This is another wordy slide. But here's a list of the variables that we used. And a lot, we had topography, we had distance from highway. That's a big one, especially for a non-motorized person. There's only so far you can get in a day, although people can get really far. Road density, forested area versus a non-forested area, an edge area. So we looked at all of these variables and the correlation of them. I'm trying not to get too sciencey. There's 3 million data points. There was a lot of data cleaning to get to the point where we could use these variables and correlate them. And so we cleaned the data. We took out a lot of the huts, the roads, the parking lots. Sometimes people would stand there, but your data is picking up points up there every 5 seconds. Any outliers we took out. And then we had to split the data. So for the hybrid, we had to do a probability surface for the motorized side of the hybrid, and then we had to do one for the non-motorized because we couldn't mix them together because those two actions were selecting different variables. And so for the snowmobile, we did an on-trail snowmobile predictive map, and then we did a snowmobile play area, the open areas where they go off-trail and ride around there. And then we had the backcountry ski. I'm almost done. Okay, so here's our maps. Here is an example of snowmobile on-road. And so the colors indicate red being a higher probability that they would select that terrain based on the similar areas that they were selecting, and then hot is higher, and then as it gets cooler, it is less probability. So snowmobile on road. This is for all of Western Colorado. snowmobile off-road, and so, which actually makes a lot of sense to me. Does this thing have a pointer? Oh, I screwed something up. Okay, this. Okay, so which we can already kind of see that. And so here we've got Rabbit Ears Pass, and we have a large winter motorized area. We've got the Vail Pass winter rec area here. We have the potential in the flat tops here, and then the Mesa right here. So, and then your area, I don't know it very well, I'm sorry, but you know, there's quite a bit that shows up in this area that has the potential to be a similar recreation terrain and experience than what these folks were doing throughout the study. And then we have our hybrid. We have the snowmobile side, so the snowmobile takes you out to a certain point, drops the skier or snowboarder off, and then they ski in that terrain. And so that, again, the red being the higher probability of an area that they would do that same type of recreation. And then the last one is our backcountry ski. And so we were really excited about building this resource selection function for human use because we hadn't done it before. And I think that we could continue to collect data and update this anytime we needed to. Now that the model is built, we can funnel this data in. We could funnel a new type of recreation, the snow bikes. Yeah, snow bikes, fat tire bikes, all those different types of recreation that has grown since we did this study. And the data would be a lot easier to get than it was from handing out a GPS unit because everybody has an app on their phone, and so they're tracking themselves. So having a data drop database or somewhere where you can place that data, you don't have to tell us who you are or anything. Everything was anonymous for our samples, and you could, you know, continue to build this database of this snapshot in time of how people are recreating in the landscape. And some people came up to us and they said, we don't want to give you our information because we're going to get in trouble because we're going where we're not going to. We're like, we don't care. We're just doing research. We want you guys to tell us where you're going so we can then manage things better. So these are the maps we produced to look at the probability of recreation across Western Colorado based on the recreation data that we had collected. So, okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So Kay Hopkins is our one of our recreation wilderness managers for the White River National Forest. And so I've worked quite a bit with her throughout the study, and then what do we do with this recreation data set, and also with Rich Doak. And they're pretty excited because I think that while we were reactive in collecting this, I think it can teach us a lot about future recreation planning in the dispersed setting. So I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay.
Do I have to switch the microphone to her? Whoever gave me the microphone.
Oh, you have.
Okay.
One.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want this?
Thank you.
We should, can you throw some Bangkok in?
Okay.
Right where your jacket is.
So my name is Kay Hopkins, and I'm the outdoor recreation planner for the White River. I work out of the Glenwood Springs office, and I help the districts do all of their recreation planning for high use areas or do forest-wide planning in terms of like travel management, oil and gas, forest plan revisions, that kind of thing. So this kind of data set and research was of course, great interest to us. and to the public. And I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of how, at a 30,000 foot level, of how research like this is super helpful. We finished our travel management plan in 2011, and it tiered to our forest plan, which was done in 2002. So the forest plan really sets the stage for future planning, and when you do your travel planning, it has to meet up or match your objectives, your management prescriptions across the landscape. So it's really important to know all. This may seem like, wow, there's a lot of detail, and how do you use all that, and how do you get all the other details in with that as well? So I'm just going to really talk about how the recreation study fits with winter travel planning. If you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to start at the, like I said, the 30,000 foot level. Anytime you do data collection or research prior to your actual travel planning process, it's super helpful for many reasons. One, like Liz said, you're getting the actual recreation users on the landscape to participate by either, helping you collect data. It helps them get better informed on what you're trying to do in the landscape. And that really helps get people to the table. And most of those people have a sense of place where they're recreating, and they'll stay at the table and stay engaged if they're part of the research and study process and data collection. So I think it's just like having meetings like this, where you try to get people engaged and inform them on how these kinds of things can help. So if you do that early, I can't say enough about early engagement and keeping people involved. It really helps. The other thing it does is it brings people together from different user types, or people who do different activities. So it just puts everybody in the table, or at the table, and it allows people to discuss their different desires and how they may have conflict or not, and within that landscape. So I think anytime you can do research ahead of time or utilize any kind of study process, it's very helpful in the travel planning process. The other thing it does is it improves customer service, and that really is coming from an agency standpoint, in that we can, through research, then we can better understand the why. And Melanie hit on this, and it's the big human dimension piece. While research like this is super important because it tells the story of the existing condition in the biophysical sense, right? But it doesn't give us the human dimension piece. It tells us what terrain they want to select, what time they want to recreate, but it doesn't tell us the why they go to that place. Is it because it's close to home? It gives them, really good exercise. They can be with their friends and their family. Is it because of the scenery? Is it the challenge? Is it the snow conditions, the elevation? It's got all of that kind of stuff. Really helps managers understand the setting and why people go and recreate where they go, and what desires do they have. Because a lot of times, just because you're motorized or non-motorized, a lot of people have similar reasons on why they want to go to that landscape. And so it's very important to understand that, so you can better manage, you can do separation of uses if you need to, and provide visitors what they're seeking. That's a really tough thing to do because it requires a lot of visitor survey data, or there's benefits-based management studies. There's a whole ton of stuff that you can do for human dimensions. But I think getting people together to talk early is the first step. And it's just super important to really better understand the why. It also establishes existing use, like we just said. We'll say that over and over. Research like this really gives managers a good understanding of the current condition. And it helps us understand, like I said earlier, what uses, what Liz depicted here, with all those variables, why people do what they do, where they do it, and you can map it out like she did across the whole western part of the state. Pretty cool stuff. I mean, that's pretty amazing that you can do that. Now, when it comes down to ground truthing that, who do we need? We need you as the visitor and the stakeholder. We need you guys to be engaged and to really tell us the other part of the story. But it's really helpful to display, and show people the data that we have. And the more data, of course, you have, sometimes it can make people more confused, but the more information you have going into a travel planning process, the better. I mean, it's really super helpful to make the right decisions. The terrain selection thing is really interesting, not only from a standpoint of management and different uses, but also as it relates to avalanche, danger and avalanche ratings. And so it's interesting to see what the aspect, the slope, what people, where they're going. And like the Silverton or the San Juan example was a great example of that, and showing where people were scanning up and coming down and what kind of terrain people use. Because like Liz says, we can manage landscapes, designate areas open to this, closed to that, but not all the terrain is typically utilized, right? I mean, we know that by just common sense tells us that, but it's good to be able to depict that in a planning process, because what that gets back to a lot of times is, and I'm going to go into this next, is if we can go to the next slide, is how the Forest Service used to do travel management. And it's the current condition before the Forest Service had to do the travel rule. So the travel rule basically told all forests, you have to do motorized vehicle use maps, you need to do your travel management for all motorized use, you need to do winter travel, and you also have to do a whole study on the minimal road system or sustaining a whole road system. So the winter travel piece, a lot of people haven't done yet. And our old winter travel, prior to our 2011, our travel management used to be based on purely winter wildlife exclusion areas, congressional closed areas, and then everything else was open. Because we didn't have conflicts. I mean, it was, and with the technology, most snowmobiles stayed on roads, on trails that were groomed. They didn't have the hot shot, bikes that they have today that are converted, or the really high powered snow machines. So it wasn't that big of a deal. We had a lot of people, it kind of, just happened out there in the landscape. But that also says that within 20 years, with the population growing, the technology changing, everything has changed a lot since what we used to do in travel management. So when you come from a place where everything was open, people people want to attach themselves to acres or miles of their existing opportunity. What research like this does is it helps to display that while all of those acres may have been open to use for motorized, non-motorized, whatever, not all of the terrain was available, right? And so when you start getting into these new travel planning processes, what happens is, like I said, it's hard to get people away from attaching themselves to the current condition, and because it's change, right? And it's about a potential taking, if you will, whether it's acres or miles or what have you. So it's really important to understand how travel management has changed and how it used to occur. But that's really where we came from. It was just basically everything was open. I think that, I'm trying to think if I've missed anything. Yeah, I think that was pretty much it. I'm back to the partner engagement. These are lessons learned. What I'm talking about here are things that we as the White River learned in our travel planning. Our travel planning took 9 years, and that's a long time, and that doesn't have to happen everywhere, but we did our forest plan first, and like I said, our travel management started almost immediately after our forest plan. And we started to look at different landscapes and work on different things. Partner engagement, I think our best example there is Vail Pass. At Vail Pass, we had a travel management plan in place that had been worked on and negotiated with partners for many years, a lot of stakeholders that managed the area. in collaboration with non-motorized, motorized people with the state park grant, funds for grooming and for snowcats. It was a really amazing collaborative process. So we took that plan and just adopted it right into our travel management plan in whole. It was fully supported. It had been implemented. It was a good piece of work. And I can't, like I said earlier, I can't emphasize enough that getting stakeholders engaged early is really critical to the conversation and to the final decision, because ultimately, it's your lands, your forests. We want to do what the public needs, but we need to do it in a balanced manner, right? We can't provide everything for everyone everywhere, and I think everyone gets that as Colorado gets busier and busier, and we have this big population boom happening on the Front Range and in other places. But I think it's just super important to emphasize that part about getting partners engaged early and having that conversation about the travel management plan. The other thing it does, I've already talked about the quantitative versus the qualitative, but I'm going to hit on that a little bit here while we're talking about partnerships in this research. This research does a really good job, like I said, of showing us a current condition in a quantitative manner. What it does not do is it does not give us the human dimension piece like Melanie talked to. That's tough, but the only way we can get it is by asking you guys, our visitors, our users, our stakeholders, our permittees, our outfitters and guides, our local communities, and ask what's important to them and why, what demographic in terms of recreation users are we going to serve in this landscape versus this landscape? Because if you try to do everything for everyone, you quickly you homogenize the experience. Everything becomes a McDonald's, right? You don't have high quality experiences set up for people to be able to obtain what they desire. It could be quiet, solitude, steep terrain, beautiful wide open, landscape views across the mountains, and people want that from all different types of recreation activities. So it's really important to try to balance that. Do you have to do that everywhere? No. In some places you don't have the high use and you don't have all of the conflict, and that's okay. But partner engagement is really critical to that. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, I think I have up here, what is this? Is this quantitative? Yeah, NEPA is not planning. So who knows what NEPA is? I hate to use these acronyms. Okay, most people. NEPA is a National Environmental Policy Act that we have to do environmental assessments or some level of assessment every time we take a management action. Whether it's an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, it's meant to get the public involved and help us make good decisions and make sure that the public is informed every step of the way. It's also meant to disclose any potential impacts that we may have in that decision making. But what's important about travel management is, planning, NEPA is not planning. Planning should happen before you do your national environmental policy work. You need to do your planning ahead of time, and then that EA or EIS analyzes what that planning is. It could be just an alternative, right? You can develop an alternative as a stakeholder group for a certain landscape of, regarding travel management. That's planning. Good planning makes good NEPA. But it's not the other way around. And so a lot of times what we see is, just out of necessity, you see environmental assessments analyzing a proposed action, but the proposed action is just something that is thrown together because people don't have enough information. We're hoping that the visitors or you as the public will give us that information and help create a better alternative. It's better to go into the NEPA work with the good alternative, right? And you can tweak it and make it better through that planning process. So that was just something I wanted to talk about in terms of using research. I've talked a lot about the quantitative versus qualitative and human dimension piece, but I can't emphasize enough that understanding the why people go where they go is so critical. Because while you have this data, what you don't have is you don't know if your management is meeting people's desired experiences. And it's easy to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. We're struggling with that right now at Hanging Lake. We've done planning for Maroon Bells Wilderness. We have all these high-use, places, and I'm not saying here in Gunnison you have all that, but what's important is to look to the future. What we have today is a good example of our current condition. It's a snapshot in time. What it doesn't do is it doesn't give us the information on what future recreation trends look like, what economies, recreation economies might be, population growth, all of that participation in different recreation activities. There's all sorts of research and studies that really lay out projections to 2030. We have the State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, the SCORP. There's a lot of good research that looks into the future for recreation trends. So when we look at stuff like this, it's awesome because it helps us understand what the current activities are, but in 10 years, 20 years, what's going to be the next activity? We don't know. We don't have a glass ball, but what we do know is we have enough research at our hands today to help inform those decisions. And all I can say is, I have up there, more equals more. We're going to see more people, more recreation. We're going to see more conflict, more overlap, especially off the I-70 corridor in the Front Range Forest. We're just seeing more and more potential visitor conflict and dissatisfaction. And so, like I said, it's super important to understand the why so we can help build that in and create some sense of balance and delivery to what the public really wants and what their desires are. Because managing by activity alone does not work. I can tell you that pretty straight. You can't just manage by activity types. Because, like what I said earlier, about a lot of us want the same thing, and it may create some overlap, just like you saw. And a lot of us want the same terrain, and so it's understanding the whole picture. So I think the current and future demand discussion, it's like I said, it's pretty critical to planning and how you move forward. So I just encourage, all of user groups and visitors to really get engaged. There's no other message I really have other than that's super important. I think, that's my biggest message here today. The more equals more thing, I need to go back to that, and I think that really what I'm trying to say is the more uses and different type of uses you put into an area, and it's pretty common sense, the more intensive the management's going to be, and the more costly the management's going to be. Now, Vail Pass, it's a fee area. They're trying to generate enough fee to sustain that recreation area, but it barely covers the plowing of the parking lot and the grooming. So it, like I said, more equals more. And more people you put into an area, the more it will drive separation of uses and potential conflict. And so, that's pretty common sense stuff, but just like the links, we all kind of wanted the same terrain. And so this is displaying that, whereas our old forest, travel management process before was, well, everything's open. We didn't really know what landscapes people were really using or what terrain they were using. So this really helps dial it in. I think that's an important thing. The other thing I wanted to talk about was visitor conflict. Like I've said, the current condition is going to change. We all know that the only thing for certain is that nothing is for certain, and everything, is going to change. We do know that the landscape hopefully won't change too much, right? The climate conditions may change. What's that going to drive in terms of activity or where places people seek to do the recreation, places they go? I mean, it's going to drive a lot of change. So I think that we just have to keep in mind that can create visitor conflict. And when people are dissatisfied and they leave, with, I don't know, with an unpleasant experience, a lot of times that creates even more conflict, because when people aren't happy, they make sure that other people all around them aren't happy, and it can really grow and just cause more and more management requirements. I think, the supply and demand thing, I'm going to talk just real quickly about two. Supply and demand is really, our supply is we know what our supply is. We have an infinite landscape out there. Our forests, the landscape is the landscape. We're not growing new land, right? What we don't know is what the demand, we know what the current demand is, but we don't know what the future demand will be. And so, like I said earlier about using research that really focuses on future trends and statistical information regarding, population growth and economies, all of that's really important, because desire doesn't equal demand. When you do planning, that's a hard thing to communicate with people. Supply and demand literally can be a quantitative exercise, but it also needs to bring in that human dimension piece. So it's a difficult balance, and but it's an important one. And so when you look at a forest in whole, and you're looking at supply versus demand, you need to look outside of that forest landscape. You need to look at adjacent forests, adjacent BLM, adjacent ski areas. What are they supplying? And it gets back to what I said earlier about not homogenizing everybody's experience and trying to be everything to everybody everywhere. So it's a critical exercise, but sometimes it's a hard one. And we were lucky on the White River. Like I said, it took 9 years actually to finish our travel plan. But in the end, we had a lot of good engagement with a lot of good partners, and we were able to pretty much do a fair job in distributing equitably uses across the landscape the best we could, and while considering local economies. We did an additional exercise on our forest. We did some niche mapping, and what that did is it basically mapped areas that were adjacent to ski areas or along river corridors or backcountry recreation, and so it helped our districts focus on what we were trying to provide in certain landscapes. So, and how that would tie to, like, adjacent to Vail Ski Area, or in the Roaring Fork Valley. And as you move out, what kind of experiences are you trying to provide, and where they fit and where they don't, with all other sideboards that happen with planning. And so I hope that helps you guys. I mean, it's a process. Travel management is a big process, and anytime you can use data like this or do additional research in the human dimension side, or just do a lot of visitor survey work, it will really help in the end. You'll get a better product, better visitor satisfaction, and because that's what we strive to do. I mean, we hope to balance things the best we can. There'll always be a little conflict here and there, but I can say that mostly on the White River now, our conflict isn't so much in the winter. The only thing that we haven't planned for is fat tire snow bikes. And we're working with IMBA, a local chapter of IMBA in the Roaring Fork Valley right now, on a proposal for fat tire snow biking. And so it just never stops. Travel management never stops. It just always changes. So it, I think I'm always amending maps. But anyway, I wish you guys luck, and I think it's great that you have this series and you're starting with these learning series like this, because it's a good opportunity. It's really good. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah.
like to do, because there's a lot of data coming at us right now, and I'd like to maybe have about 15 minutes of questions for these presenters, and then I'll shift gears a little bit to something more local, and then we can have a broad conversation with all of us at the end. So do we have questions for Liz or Kay? Go ahead, Bill. Oh, go. Nope, go for it.
I think we saw some of the data that you collected there, but what are your overall final conclusions in terms of like impacts on things per user group and activity, if you will?
So we are still working through a little bit of that, but some of the preliminary conclusions show that they coexist. There is a threshold, and we feel like we probably see that threshold in a developed ski area within the operational boundary. If we provide suitable connectivity, they can continue to coexist. When we take away that or increase road use or take away vegetation, it shrinks their footprint. Out of the user groups, the most we learned a lot, hybrid user groups seem to overlap links during the day the most than any other user group. And the only thing we could conclude from that is they're able to get further back, and then they ski that exact terrain that links reside in. The variables that links select were the same variables that hybrid skiing part, not the snowmobiling part, select. Is the best snow in the trees. And that's where you have your links hunkered down and residing during the day. So, yeah.
I'm trying to get a picture of the actual planning process. In the White River, was there a regularly scheduled forum where stakeholders would come to a conference room and sit around the table?
Yes, the way the planning process worked, and I knew this process question would come up, but it can grow differently across different forests depending on how they do their travel management planning and when. But for the White River, right on the heels of our forest plan revision, they started almost immediately into working on travel. So each district did public meetings, had maps, got maps out, worked with the public on who was doing what where, because we did both winter and summer and forest-wide. So it was a huge, huge effort. And it took a lot of time. Like I said, you had those sideboards of what sideboards we had in accordance with the forest plan, whether it was congressional designations, winter wildlife exclusion areas. All of the travel needed to, basically fit in those parameters. So we just took all that out to the public and just started working on maps, user-created routes, existing routes, new proposed routes for both summer and winter. Now in the winter, have you seen a winter motor vehicle use map? Yes, okay. So yeah, we of course had to designate open areas, closed areas, and restricted areas. Restricted areas are areas where there has to be a designated route going through it, but you can't go cross country in it. So we did that across the forest at each district. So it did take a long time. So we did have a lot of public meetings.
So the second half of my question is, we have all the diverse stakeholder groups that are participating in the planning process. How is the flora, fauna, and environment represented in that deliberative process? Are there biologists that sit in forums and provide the insights needed to guide some decisions?
Yep.
There are.
Yes.
How are the parks and wildlife?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Forest Service.
Yes.
So as part of that broader forum, you expect those people to be there?
Absolutely, and they're a big part of that. And you bring up a really good point that I didn't talk about. I talked a lot about partners in terms of visitors, but yeah, a lot of our communities, county commissioners, city managers, ski area representatives, everybody is affected. Travel management is one of the most important decisions that a forest can make, because it dictates how people travel and move across the landscape. And so it affects, to your point, it can have an effect on every resource, whether it's plants, whether it's animals, soil, our water, All of that is taken into consideration. And that's why I kind of brought in the forest plan, because the forest plan actually has management area prescriptions that take all of that into effect or into consideration. And we have desired conditions laid out for landscapes. We have standards and guidelines for those landscapes and what can happen, what can't. And so the framework is pretty good, but there's a lot of gray, right? And so yeah, it's a big conversation. Yep.
How far in the future did the White River look, and what's typical with other forests that you're aware of?
Typically, forest plans are supposed to last 20 to 25 years. And so most forest plans, most research goes out, to 20-some years. You try to project out at least that far. Now we're coming up, well, our plan was done in 2002. Our travel plan was done in 2011. So we tried to, lay out what we thought would be good and sustainable. That's the other thing I didn't really focus on, but part of the Forest Service's job in the travel rule is to make sure that our system is sustainable, and that means not only from a physical sense, but from a financial capability of the agency to maintain roads and trails to standard. And so that's a huge lift, and that's a big question, because a lot of what we do relies on partners and you guys, because we, now we're doing all of our trail work and everything with youth corps and volunteer organizations. We don't have trail crews, and so it's quite the balance when you talk about sustainable travel systems. So we have to do that as well, analyze that when we do our travel planning.
A lot of the information that you gave us was focused on high altitude areas, deep snow, winter recreation activities primary, but those areas, most of the wildlife has moved out clearly. Links are an exception, and that's why you focus some research on that. But those, the majority of wildlife that are high altitude, then move into the valley bottoms, and we know that there is quite a bit of demand, particularly surrounding urban areas or the public lands close to urban areas. How much did that play into your winter planning activities, looking at those lower altitude urban interface areas that may not have as big a snow or as heavy an activity, but have much more potential for wildlife use or conflicts?
Do you want me to take it, or you want
Sure. We can both go first.
Yeah, it had a huge effect in our travel decisions, because our forest, as you know, is it's pretty much dissected by I-70, Highway 82. So we manage a lot of river valleys where the valley floors are all developed. A lot of the private big valley floors that used to be winter habitat are gone. And so the only place left to mitigate for winter wildlife is in that urban interface zone, in the lower elevation country. So it had a huge effect on our travel management, because a lot of those areas were closed. They're closed. They're not closed to foot, i.e. snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, but they're closed to any kind of mechanized or motorized travel. And so a lot of and Liz's, study did a lot of, it's kind of common sense stuff, but really what you have to look at is winter access points that get you to areas that are outside of those zones. But on the White River, with all those valley floors, it had a huge effect on our travel. And so there's a lot of discussion now about the whole fat tire snow bike thing, because, we made decisions on bicycles for summer only, because there wasn't really, snow bikes were just coming on and into the scene They weren't really around. There wasn't that many. We consulted with the Snowmobile Association and to see if that would be conflict with their snowmobile, groom tracks, and it just wasn't something that we dove into headfirst. But now we are. So that interim. What do I want to say? The lower elevation zones is going to be of huge concern because of compaction that we had to consult. I'll let Liz talk about that. But yeah, it had a huge effect on where we manage for rec.
Yeah, and we worked closely with the state CPW, and a lot of it is seasonal restrictions and allowing herds or animals to have that really critical time frame to be successful, whether it be winter time is critical just for feeding, or whether it be a reproductive season for their young to survive. And so a lot of it was managed through seasonal closure. And then, like she was saying, through a non-motorized focus, rather than a motorized focus, to limit disturbance. There aren't a lot of areas. It's a very developed corridor, and it's continuing to grow and develop more. And so it's an everyday conversation, wildlife management and development and use patterns, and how to balance that. So it's an ongoing conversation.
So a follow-up, you mentioned that your strategy in those lower countries were to close them to motorized use and mechanized use, but not to the quiet use. Have you been satisfied that that's been a successful strategy, or do you feel that even that quiet use has a negative effect on wildlife that you're getting to be uncomfortable with?
That's a debate that's ongoing, as Liz said, and the Forest Service with the White River has not closed any area other than some unexploded ordnance areas. They haven't closed any area to human entry. That's a huge, closing area to human entry is a huge conversation that is very difficult, of course, to enforce. And how do you keep people from walking into the forest wherever they want to walk? And so the CPW actually in the Roaring Fork Valley is collaring some elk and deer, I think, this year because of that conversation, because there's so much recreation and so much demand in these high developed, recreation area corridors, whether it's Summit County from Breckenridge to Frisco, or it's, the Aspen and Roaring Fork corridors. There's just a lot of people, and they're all wanting to get into the hills and recreate. So yeah, they're doing a study to see if humans have an impact. And we'll see, we'll see where that lands, because like I said, in the Roaring Fork especially, the only place to mitigate for wildlife impacts or to, manage wildlife is on federal ground, because the valley floors are gone. They're all developed. So yeah, it's a really delicate balance. So most of our winter recreation areas require people to drive, like on the Flat Tops. The Flat Tops is a huge winter recreation area for us. You have to go up on the Coffee Pot on the southeast corner, or the Buford Newcastle Road on the west side, or out of Meeker. You go up north of or west of Meeker to access a lot of that country. But we have other areas like the 4 Mile area and other areas to recreate south of Eagle, the Hartscrabble area, but it all requires driving. So it kind of gets back to my point earlier about being everything to everybody in their backyard. It's really hard on the White River. Mostly that urban interface is a tough balance. But we work with the counties and BLM, and we all try to have a cohesive management strategy on how to manage for wildlife, how to get people to where they can recreate without impacting.
You had mentioned something that I wanted to ask about, and that was enforcement. Did you make any decisions on the ability to enforce a given area, or is it mostly relied on peer pressure?
Yes, we did make decisions, but to your point, manageability is a huge consideration. So like I said, the more you concentrate, people in the same area, more equals more. It makes for more management because of more conflict, more overlap. What we concentrate on the Forest Service is education. We really try to help people through education and information. On the White River, there's so many people. Why we do enforcement, I hate to say it's rare, but our tactic in travel management has always been informational based. We try to help people make the right decision, and we've never been very heavy-handed. But we haven't had to be, mostly because a lot of the decisions we made were pretty much supported by the user groups, and we have a few exceptions, of course, but we haven't had to have a lot of really heavy enforcement, but it's a huge consideration, yes. When you plan for stuff like that, you need to be able to make it happen, and if there's big time problems or conflicts. So hopefully you plan so where you mitigate that and you don't have to have a lot of enforcement. Vail Pass has rangers there, but they're really there to help people and give them maps, groom the trails, sign the trails, and really do a public service, give the public enhanced experiences. They're not there to write tickets or, yeah.
Take one more question and then we'll shift gears.
I was going to ask about ranchers. We have such a huge ranching community here. So many acres, so full public environments. Is that a piece of the puzzle in the White River area?
Yeah, it is on the north side of our forest in Meeker. In terms of travel management in the winter, a lot of the wildlife, of course, comes down onto the private, like I'm sure it does here, right? It's really more of an issue. We actually did travel management for the winter based on dates in coordination with hunting season. So our winter season is not based on snow depth, and which is a little different than a lot of forests do it on, once a snow depth of this many inches, then it's, over the snow vehicle travel, no wheel travel. We did our travel with dates in mind. So we did it with hunting season. We coordinated it with the hunting season with CPW. So November 23rd is when we moved to over the snow vehicle use. And the reason I'm bringing that up to your question is, most of our interactions with ranching or trespass or problems with winter recreation really is more around hunting season. But during the winter, we don't have a lot of conflict typically, because people are getting up onto the high country. They're getting on top of the flat tops, or they're getting on top of Hardscrabble area, Red Table, all of the areas we have. So it hasn't been an issue. Do you have issues with travel in the winter on your ranch, or? Oh, okay. Yeah, that seems to be our most, and we definitely in the travel management process try to mitigate any unintended consequences, like dead end spurs, routes that go nowhere but up to a private fence. You try to take all that into consideration when you're making those decisions, so you don't create more problems that you can enforce and put it on someone else, So yeah, that's all part of travel management planning.
All right. Well, we'll shift gears for just a moment, but leave these guys on stage because we'll come back to you in a moment. I have a lot of data envy and a little bit of links envy right now. I want to work with cute fuzzy animals too. I have pictures, but they're not as cute. So I wanted to give just a little background on some of the work that we've been doing here at Western, just to bring it back to the Gunnison Valley, give us a perspective on some small pieces of research that we are doing here, and again, bring it back to that conversation of other places that we might go. So as a bit of background, as Corey mentioned in the very beginning, and she and I both teach in the Master in Environmental Management program here at Western, and which has a bit of a different opportunity, I think, for students and for faculty in terms of research and engagement, and really crossing a bridge between the two and thinking about research as it informs practice and as it informs management practices, such as we're talking about today. And our collaboration in winter recreation study really began in 2015 when Silent Tracks approached me with questions about understanding winter recreation in the Crested Butte area. And we brought in this, oh, there they are, very serious team of research students. This was my environmental management class in fall of 2015. And they took on this question of, what could be done to better understand winter recreation in the valley, particularly on the northern end of the valley. And after working for the whole semester on the issue and exploring it from many perspectives, many entry points, the students came away with two primary recommendations. Their first was to engage more stakeholders, and their second was to gather more information. And this was despite the fact that one of the first things that I teach my students in my environmental policy class is that very few management or governance decisions are actually based on data. But they still saw the importance of data, and I'll concede the point that this may be changing here. This is a report from 2017. This was a collaborative report that a bipartisan act supported by both Paul Ryan and President Obama. And they commissioned a report on how the US government could more effectively use data in decision making. And the quotes summarizing their findings and their conclusion that in an age when our data capabilities are so robust, we could do much more to use data to inform management decisions. So here the quote, the American people want a government that solves problems. This requires that decision makers have good information to guide their choices about how current programs and policies are working and how they can be improved. Improved access to data can lead to an increase in both the quantity and quality of evidence to inform important program and policy decisions. And I would argue that locally, our land managers and our government decision makers are eager to have better data to inform their governance. And our students here at Western are ready to develop these kinds of data collection plans, organize field work, conduct the analysis as part of our service to the community and the work that we aim to do to create a more just and sustainable places to live in Gunnison and beyond. So in my time with the MEM program, I found many graduate students, some of whom are here today, who are eager to do just that type of work. And as one example, this is one of our first graduate students in the MEM program, Brian Lieberman, who initiated a project in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management and the Crested Butte Land Trust to study recreation use in the Slate River area, and particularly the Obi-Joyful drainage. And so he did this incredible summer of field work where he was out on the trail every single day. He was talking to people. He was looking, he had traffic counters looking at use and numbers, and compiled this really robust collection of data about what was happening in the Obi-Joyful area, and then shared it with his community partners in the Bureau of Land Management. And the work that he did actually has informed the decisions that you've seen happening over the last couple years in terms of putting in some camping limitations in the Obi-Joyful area, creating a fee structure, and bringing in some practices to actually materialize his work on the landscape. So again, at a very small scale, but really digging down into what's happening in a particular place and collecting information that directly informs management decisions. And so, being the wise professor that I am, I'm a wise park ranger, but I'm also a wise professor, I immediately turned to Brian Lieberman when we started talking about increasing our winter research, and asked him to help us think through what we could do to design a winter management project like unto what he had done in the Slate River area. So that moves us into another phase from 2017 to 2018, where we've been conducting some preliminary work and then a little bit more robust study of who our recreation users are in the Crested Butte drainages. So we engaged Brian Lieberman to do the initial research design and planning with us, and then he turned the project over to Doug Shaw, who did our first kind of full season of data collection last year, last fall, or last late winter into early spring. He graduated in May and has handed it off now, and we have another student, Kendall Cox, who is going to continue that project through the winter. And just as a sense of scale here, we didn't talk about funding that went on for their project, but we've been funded by the town of Crested Butte and by our stakeholder groups, and particularly by community members who are giving money to this project, which I think is tremendous evidence of your investment in understanding what's happening in recreation here and really having some good data to inform our planning processes. So I think it's pretty cool the way that we're engaging students and bringing them into this project. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that Doug did. I can provide, if anyone is interested, his full, robust data set. I can provide lots of charts and graphs. We're very happy to share that information with you. But for the sake of all of our attention spans at 8 o'clock at night, I'm going to just breeze through a few key points tonight. So this shows the locations that Doug was working in. So we tried to capture all of the major use drainages in Crested Butte. We actually expanded that beyond the initial places that we thought we would focus. But you can see that he was trying to capture trailhead data at these different areas and used multiple locations on some of the drainages that were a little bit harder to capture. And his method was basic. We were using an image capture and then analyzing the images and just tallying data. So this is a really rudimentary data collection method. I'm just trying to get some preliminary understanding of what's happening out there. So we used images. We used cameras that were capturing images, motion sensor cameras. You can see one here posted just on a post there, trying to capture images of recreation, but also I have a cute fox. There's a cute fox in my image here. So that shows the camera setup, and then this is what the camera is capturing across the way. Here's a cute fox walking by that camera. But of course, mostly we were looking at visitor and human users of these trails. And so every couple days, Doug would go out, he would switch the data card in the camera, he would bring all of those images back, and he would sit at his computer and pull up all of those images and analyze them. So there's a lot of problems when it comes to image capture that you may not anticipate. For example, all of you very fast snowmobilers out there can go by a camera faster than a cold camera can warm up enough to take your image as you're going by. So we got a lot of images like this where you see the roost coming out behind, or you see tracks and have evidence that something came through, but you don't actually know what came through. And then, of course, while you're working in winter, you're dealing with conditions that often fogged or clouded, and you end up with some mysterious snow creature walking through on the image. So even though these are our image capture methods, they're not necessarily perfect still in capturing what's happening there. And so we collect the images, you go through and analyze them, and basically then do a tallying system. And Doug was looking at different types of user groups, which, as you can imagine, becomes pretty complicated. We have a lot of different types of users, and how do you categorize them, and how do you manage them in ways that generate useful data. So we have everything from our fat bike users to several different types of snow machines, converted side-by-sides, grooming machines, geo-trackers that have wheels on them, and hybrid users, and all sorts there. And so we have a really sophisticated tallying system here where we used a bunch of clickers and tried to tally up images for each trail head, or each one of these says, what, it's a snow bike here, or UTV. So we're tallying up those users. And that produces a really big, fancy spreadsheet with a lot of data points on it. So just, you can see this, again, a small sample. This is the Slate River drainage. For a couple weeks, late December to early January, we did record snowfall, trying to correlate some of the snowfall. This might have been like the last snow we got that year, 1225. And then each of these is the category, right, of what your users are. So if it's someone who's walking, if it's a fat bike, a hybrid user, and then this lovely unknown catch-all at the end. So just a raw data set cataloged by different user group on the different day as they traveled through or from the trailhead. And then there's several things you can do with this. So here's a totals page that just shows kind of what we saw over the whole course of the winter. Again, being the first year, we were trying to get this data out. The collection days varied considerably. We had pretty good comprehensive data from Washington Gulch and Kebler Pass, or at Slate River, and it took a lot longer to try to get cameras set up and everything calibrated. And so some of our drainages, we have a lot less data. So this would just be your total of motorized, mechanized, and non-motorized users by totals and by averages per day at each of the different drainages. So one example of kind of what you can do with that type of data to understand who's out there on any given day. And then Doug did a whole series, and again, I'm very happy to share these, sort of showing that data in a couple different ways. This chart shows the, I can point it out here better than I can on my small screen. So the snowfall here in blue, you have your mechanized use at the bottom in yellow. You have your motorized use in red, which for Kebler Pass, this would be anticipated, and then your non-motorized use in green. So one way of just separating out the motorized and non-motorized as well as the mechanized. And then another image here that actually divides it by user group. So you can see the same information for Kebler Pass, and now it's divided up into different, hybrid snowmobile is here, and side-by-side, and cars and trucks and things. So a couple different ways to kind of look at this data, but this shows you some of the playing around that we did. Another point is that we did field test these cameras. So we went out and we had some students who actually sat there for several hours one day and actually looked at what was happening at the trailhead to try to get a sense of whether the cameras were capturing what was happening at the trailhead, if we were missing users, trying to understand who, to assure that our camera capture was working adequately. So we have pretty good reliability in most areas, a couple with some confusing parts, and we've taken that into account as we've designed and made modifications for this year. So just real quick, a couple kind of insights from this data. Again, most of this is raw data. We're not dealing with a lot of sophisticated data analysis at this point in time. But there are some kind of fun things that you can point out that maybe would inform how we think about travel management. So here's the chart, or the graph of the Brush Creek area for last year. And who can tell me what's happening right here? That would be the Grand Traverse. So all of a sudden you have this one weekend where all of your non-motorized users spikes really off the chart this year. It was last year, right, that it went out and back the same way, so you're doubling your numbers, like really crazy numbers. But then you can see what that does is that you're trying to look at your data point over the whole course of the winter. And we can adjust for that sort of from a data perspective. When we take out that outlier, you can see a lot more happening on the landscape. But from a management perspective, I think it's worth considering, are you managing for this type of average use, or are you managing for your full range? Are you managing for that one weekend when suddenly you have hundreds of users in that same landscape? Another thing that we thought was interesting that came out of the data is that we found an inverse correlation to snowfall. You might think that you would expect to see more people out using trails on days when it snowed. But look, here's a snow day, here's a snow day, here's no snow, and you've got spikes in use all throughout there. So, thinking about what might cause that, is that because everyone goes to the resort on days when you have fresh powder, you go other places, you grudgingly use the backcountry on days when the powder is not as fresh, or where you're going there to find fresh powder because there's no longer powder at the ski resort. But an interesting correlation. When we presented this data to the CB Town Council last year, they suggested that it might be worth correlating with avalanche data. Might be another data point that we could take in to look at some of the, are people making decisions about their backcountry use based upon avalanche risk. And then I'll just talk for a moment about some of the limitations and what could be conceived as strengths in this particular method. For example, here you see an image of snowmobiles that we would assume are a commercial use, right? Like all the same snowmobile, they're traveling together. So having the exact images gives us the ability to do some differentiation between, are these commercial users, are these likely people who are coming from out of town and hiring a guide to take them out versus, the person who's commuting back and forth to Irwin on their snowmobile. So we can start to piece out some little bits of information that are kind of interesting, I think, from that, so we get a sense of the variety of users. I think a limitation is that we can't really understand some of the big questions that are facing us. Like we have an interest in parking lots. What's happening in our parking lots? What's happening, the stresses in that sort of launching off moment. And we can get these images of the parking lots, but really, understanding people's arrival and those, their experience in the parking lot. Some of that information really isn't captured. And of course, we have no sense of what happens once they leave the parking lot, as we saw in Liz's presentation earlier. There's this whole other world of what happens once people leave and head out onto the trail. And then I think it really doesn't begin to understand the questions that may be of most interest to us as we think about travel planning and that interaction between different types of users and what that experience is for them, what that means to them, what their actual recreation experience is out on the trail. And so we took some other approaches to address that. But before that, I have to show you the coolest image that we got off the cameras for those of you who live in the Brush Creek area. That's a mountain lion right there. So think about that when you're skiing in the dark. So we have these wonderful, I love this image here too, of just what that hybrid use looks like, right? We've got a fat bike going on, we've got someone with snowshoes, we've got some folks headed out in the backcountry, they've got their dog, like they're traveling together, right? We want to talk about conflict, but here's, look at this, multi-use family outing going on here. But how do we begin to understand what people are looking for, what their experiences are? And so we have paired this with a qualitative survey that we've been posting. Hopefully some of you have participated in this survey. But we've deployed the survey. We did it from March 20th to April 9th in 2017. We used our stakeholder groups to help share it and get it out to winter users. We advertised it in the newspapers and on local radio, and invited people just to join in, to respond, to share their perspectives on winter use. And so we administered 20 questions online, really focusing on those 4 categories, looking at types of use, amount of use, trends, and then some of what we've been talking about, desires, preferences, what people would like to see. So that first year, we got 313 responses. We felt pretty happy about that. And just to give you a taste of kind of some of the things we were looking at, here's a question, looking just basically where do you go and how often do you go there? So where are your favorite locations to recreate or access the backcountry, and then for each location specify how many times per season, so we can get this data about where people like to go as they self-identify it. What are their places that they like to go and how often do they go there? Some potential here, right, to start to piece apart local use and outside use and all sorts of fun things. Would you like to see any more of the following implemented at winter backcountry trailheads around the Crested Butte and Gunnison region? So we asked about, do we want more trash cans? Do you want more trailhead sign? Do you want more access to groomed trails? More drainages encouraging motorized access? More drainages encouraging human-powered access? And then ask people just to rate whether that would impact their experience in a positive way, they had no opinion, or it would detract from their experience. And then one more example, oops. Looking at a specific issue, right? So we could look at public transportation. If parking is an issue at trailheads, what would people's responses be towards having public transportation available to them? Would they use it? And if so, or if not, why or why not? Because I want to ski with my dog or something like that. So, and then I guess I do have one more example here, a couple more. One looking at this idea of shared values that we talked about. I think it becomes really clear when you start talking to people about why they recreate that they have a lot of the same motivations in doing it. That we saw some strong values that came through throughout the survey. And then finally, an example for the conversation today, perception of the winter travel management plan, just a summary statement we asked them to respond to. the current winter travel management plan user designations in the Gunnison National Forest surrounding Crested Butte is meeting the needs of backcountry users in Gunnison County. And then they responded on a range from I strongly agree to I strongly disagree or I'm not familiar. So some interesting data kind of looking at people's opinions and ideas and values around winter travel planning. And so just a quick thought on sort of where we might go with this and research directions. Of course, we've seen some examples of how you could really scale this up. This was pretty preliminary and looking at a very small scale, but we really tried to bring together some of that survey information along with some understanding of just who's out there and what was happening there. A resource that I'll point you toward, we've done some work with the Colorado Mountain Club, who has been, as Liz talked about, using some of the data and information on your smartphone so that you can track that information, and they've got an ongoing mapping project, the Powder project, that you can get online and think about that, or participate in some of those types of mapping projects that are happening. And then I think this broader question of, some things that we'd like to do with our research, we'd like to be able to sort of scale it down and figure out what kind of sample we'd need to get a statistically significant sample without having to look at thousands and thousands of images all winter. So we're really thinking about sort of efficiency questions there so that we could spend some of our effort looking at other research questions that might inform our travel planning a little bit more. So. Again, just very preliminary. I'm very happy to share any of the information that we have from this, and then we are continuing to do the project this winter. So, get out there and support our students that are doing this research. So. And I'm happy to take questions, but we can also sort of open it up back to a broader conversation here. We have about 10 minutes left.
I think it's really interesting to collect user data from our area to make decisions locally. But they looked at user data as well as impacts on wildlife. Do we have anything going in the valley looking at impacts on wildlife of any shape or size? The fuzzy carnivores are great, but I think there's also a lot of smaller creatures that sometimes get overlooked. So do we have anything going?
I don't know of anything specific to winter.
Yeah.
Beyond, and Brandon might speak to this, I guess, in terms of what CPW is doing and in their work, but sort of large-scale winter wildlife projects, I don't know of any current research.
It's just personally, in answer to your original question, what kind of research would help inform our decision-making, that's a really important value for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so where we recreate is great, but how are we impacting the environment around us, I think is, for me personally, very important. And so to look, that's the kind of research I'd like to see so that we can understand how we are impacting our environment.
Lots of big game, stuff going on. Sage Grouse work is kind of tapered out at this point, but we have bighorn sheep, mule deer, elk, lots of animals on the air. So we'll have some ongoing big game work. There's always room for improvement.
Yeah, I just think it's good to include that in the conversation. Somebody else brought it up earlier, but.
Well, and this cross layering of recreation versus wildlife, I think, is really compelling. Yeah.
So the lynx was probably used because they're endangered, correct?
Yeah, there are
And
species.
you find that species is proxy for the behavior of other mammals?
They really are in their own category, being a mesocarnivore, mid-sized carnivore. One thing Kay and I were talking about as we were driving down, she asked a really good question. We really should have coupled the study with a prey study to go along with it, because I think prey species probably are a little bit more sensitive to the human dimension piece than lynx. I think they're able to adapt a little easier than some of the smaller mammals. So compaction, she had mentioned compaction. We look really closely at any activity they may increase compaction where we don't have it at some point in time. And in Colorado it's a little hard because think about with the snow in the spring and it seems to all be compacted based on the melting and freezing. But there is, I think, some work on some small mammal stuff that Jake Ivan was doing, but in this area, Matt, you may be able to speak to that a little bit, but I'm not sure what he compared that to, whether that was compared to human use in the area or not. So.
Okay,
study extension areas throughout Colorado that included the GMUD and included some areas in the Pennsylvania district that was looking at the size of areas that extension areas are using in ecological planning.
Yeah.
Primarily kind of that forest patch size that they're using and how they're moving between forest patches, I believe.
Okay.
Not real
Yeah.
knowledgeable about what it's looking into, but I think that was part of it.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, to answer your question, we could project out a little bit away how it may impact another animal, but it's a really unique data set collected primarily for that species. So it's kind of hard to substitute.
Is the population stable?
I believe it is in Colorado. So I've been up in Montana for a few years, and I just got back to Colorado, and I know that CPW is doing some non-invasive monitoring, but what I've heard, the numbers have been pretty stable over the last few years. So yeah, it's good. Yeah.
I just want to thank you for putting this all together and for continuing the program. I think that if this winter continues how it started, and it's a snowier winter, I suspect the numbers are going to be, quite a bit different than, say, last year when it was a pretty thin winter. So it's great that, that it's kind of ongoing, because I think that's what it takes to get a really true picture of what goes on.
It took us by surprise. We're like trying to get our batteries in the cameras yesterday in my office because we're like, it's snowing, we gotta get cameras out. Zach, go ahead.
Did you guys use any low snow contingency planning for years of low snowpack? And if not, do you see that being needed in the future?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Alternate routes or?
Right. Displacement. Displacement happens for multiple reasons, and snow is a huge part of that, right? Like if people use one area and there's no snow, where are they going to go next? And that's why, that terrain selection or terrain availability or desirability is really pretty interesting stuff, because it really helps you see what landscapes are available that aren't currently being used. And it could be because there's no access, right? There's no trailhead, or it's way back in the backcountry, or it's 2 ranges behind, or far away. But yeah, in long-term planning, we definitely had to take that into consideration in terms of supply and demand, and how you try to balance that out, because changing climate conditions are something we have to consider in planning, and it's a big deal when it comes to, as you know, it's a big deal. And I don't know how detailed we got into, like, we didn't predict like there's X amount of, less snow at this elevation per year. We didn't do that. We just made assumptions in our methodology that certain activities, and there's papers done too that take that into consideration, research papers all over. Cordell did a paper about snow sports and what activities would decrease and decline, and where, in what snow states that would happen, and where it would increase and where it would stay stable. So there is a lot of information out there. So we tried to consider that. Yeah, it's a hard one.
We can take one more question before our big raffle.
Oh, we didn't sign up.
There was a lot of recreational potential in wilderness areas. I thought that was high altitude. I thought several of them were reflected in the orange portion that you showed. Did you look at non-motorized use in wilderness areas? Are they being used? Is that area of non-motorized use considered as an asset within the non-motorized community, rather than going to areas that are simply already accessed to wilderness?
So
Yeah.
I can do one part, and
Yeah,
you're the wilderness
yeah.
expert. We had a couple of animals that we collared that were close to a wilderness boundary, but we didn't have, we had recreation folks near there, and so if they went into the wilderness, we captured that, but there wasn't a ton of use. We didn't seek that out as a separate category to collect data for. If they happen to go into the wilderness, which is pretty easy off the I-70 corridor to get up in that area, then we captured that track, but it wasn't, it's a good area to investigate a little bit further, but we didn't. And down in the San Juans, in the Weymouth, there was some wilderness use, and there was some motorized use pretty close to it. And so, but we had non-motorized use mostly captured in there. So, yeah. We,
So often in our planning, you see the wilderness areas assumed off that they will already close law, and then focus on maintaining a balance of integrable land.
Yeah, outside of wilderness.
As users, we really see that all land is part of that. There are be considered not just the remaining non-wilderness portions.
Yes, yes, and to your question, you know, we definitely considered non-motorized use in it because a lot of our wilderness areas are really butt right up to urban. So Eagle's Nest, as example, in right out of Dillon, is really close. There's a lot of trailheads very close and accessible to big subdivisions and to the town. We have a lot of non-motorized winter activities occurring there. So with the travel rule, the funny thing about the travel rule, though, of course, is it just maps motorized, right? And for winter, unless it's a groom system, which wouldn't happen in wilderness, we don't map. We have open areas, but like I said, there's no exclusions for people for non-mechanized activities in the winter. So essentially, people go where there's trails in the summer, right? Because it's the easiest way to travel, the path of least resistance. So we have a lot of trailheads into wilderness that definitely get a lot of non-motorized use in the winter. And so if you're asking if we consider that as part of our supply, is that what you were asking?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I know we're a couple different aspects of that, but from a motorized point of view, with the travel management, we look at the inventory that is already non-wilderness, how we can split it the remaining balance.
Mm-hmm.
As a skier, we look at wilderness areas as recreation eligible. As a motorized user, you don't have that opportunity.
Right. Yeah, you know, and to be honest, in a lot of areas, wilderness areas, to your point, they become kind of exclusion zones for winter use, and most of that is because they're not accessible. That's usually, you know, like a lot of wilderness areas don't have access points in the winter because they're farther back and hard to get to, but that's not always the case. So that balance, I think, that you're talking about, I think the assumption is that non-motorized people have all wilderness areas to recreate in. The problem with that, though, is a lot of them, they can't get there. So travel planning comes back to those access points, portals and access points that Liz was pointing out. It really is, of course, what dictates what happens where. But it also is very unique to each forest because like the Eagle's Nest and Holy Cross, we have trailheads that people are on all winter long.
Let's say there was an area that was restricted from motorized travel. And looking at, I got people GPSs, looked at those types of things, and said, you know, if they really couldn't follow just one great route, this is an area where even should then be retained as motorized eligible. Because it's not really being used in the way that originally this restriction envisioned.
yeah, I can answer that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Vail Pass Winter Recreation Area, it's a 50,000 acre designation, about. And before I did this study, I was working with a lot of outfitter guides up there, and we assumed, it was the compaction question. We considered that whole area compacted. But I knew there was no way that that whole area was compacted. And so when we started to run GPS units and get tracks, and granted, this is just a small percentage of the total number of people that recreate there, but the patterns were the same from the samples that we were going. So what it really illustrated was that there was a much smaller proportion of that actually a recreation footprint. And so there were opportunities to separate use or reevaluate that use. And it's my fault because I haven't gotten that data set to our rec planners to really take another dive in. We have a couple recreation technicians that started looking at that, Aubrey Miller being one of them. And really, there is a lot more opportunity to work in that designated area. And we worked with the task force and presented this, and even they were surprised. And it really helped with the links compaction question too, because it really wasn't all compacted. But we designated it as a compacted area. So yes, there's room to work there, and yes, we can learn a lot from that data set. I just need to get the data to these guys to work with it. So
Science is slow,
Yeah,
right?
we are slow.
Let's give another round of applause to Liz and Kay. And just a reminder that next week is our last in our 4-part series. We will be inviting representatives from several stakeholder groups to respond to what's been presented in these first 3 nights. So we encourage you to come back and share your own responses and thoughts and reflections, and we look forward to sort of this capstone summary experience. And that is next, I don't know what day it is today. Today's Thursday. So next Wednesday, 6:30 in this room. And let's turn it over to our fine graduate students to give away some cool prizes.
Hey everybody, I'm Todd. You got another one. Excellent. So I guess we have 3 things to give away tonight. Like I said, my name's Todd. I'm a